What if I told you that on a quiet night in Oregon, a mother drove her 3 children to the hospital, one already dead, 2 clinging to life, and then calmly claimed a stranger had tried to carjack her? But here's the chilling twist. The truth was far darker than anyone could have imagined. Welcome back to Behind the Truthstory, the channel where we uncover real-life crimes that shake you to the core. If you love true crime stories told raw and unfiltered, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, because today's case is one you will never forget. This is the disturbing story of Diane Downs, the mother who shot her own kids and blamed a stranger. Now let's dive in. The night of May 19, 1983, seemed quiet in Springfield, Oregon. Families were finishing dinner, kids were tucked into bed, and the streets were mostly empty. But out of the silence came the screech of tires and the frantic sound of a car speeding toward the emergency entrance of McKenzie-Willamette Hospital. The nurses and doctors on duty rushed outside, confused and startled by the headlights of a small Nissan Pulsar swerving into the lot. The driver's door flew open, and a woman with blonde hair stumbled out, screaming, "Help my kids! Somebody shot my kids!" The medical team ran to the car. What they found inside was something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the passenger seat, 9-year-old Cheryl lay slumped and unmoving. She had been shot in the chest. Blood covered her shirt, and her eyes were lifeless. In the back seat, 7-year-old Danny was struggling to breathe. He had been shot in the back, the bullet crushing his spine. He could no longer feel his legs. Beside him was 8-year-old Christy, who had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the side. Her small body trembled with shock, her lips moving but no sound coming out. And then there was the driver, their mother, Diane Downs. She had a small wound on her left arm. The bullet had only grazed her skin. The doctors rushed the children inside, their hands working quickly, their hearts racing. 1 child was dead. 2 were fighting for their lives. And the mother stood there in the bright hospital lights, pale but calm, almost strangely calm. When police arrived minutes later, Diane gave them a story that sounded like something out of a late-night horror movie. She said she had been driving home with her kids when she noticed a man on the side of the road, waving her down. Thinking he needed help, she pulled over. But instead of asking for help, the man pointed a gun at her and demanded her car. When she refused, the stranger leaned in and opened fire on the children. Panicked, Diane said she fought him off, jumped back in the car and sped to the hospital. She insisted she had done everything she could to save her children. The officers nodded, taking notes. It was a terrifying story. A stranger, a gun, 3 innocent children. On the surface, Diane looked like a mother who had survived a nightmare. But for the seasoned detectives listening, something didn't sit right. They noticed her arm wound. It was shallow, barely more than a scratch. They noticed how she spoke. Calm, measured, almost rehearsed. They noticed how she didn't rush to her surviving children's bedsides, choosing instead to stand outside the ER, chatting and answering questions as if nothing had happened. And one more thing stood out. Witnesses later said Diane's car hadn't been racing down the road to the hospital as she claimed. Instead, they saw it moving slowly, almost at a crawl, as if she wasn't in a hurry at all. Already, the cracks in her story were beginning to show. While the children lay in the hospital, Cheryl gone forever, Danny paralyzed, Christy clinging to life, the investigation into Diane Downs began. Detectives retraced her steps, searched the supposed crime scene, and looked for signs of the mysterious stranger she described. But the road where she said it all happened told a different story. There were no footprints, no tire marks, no fingerprints, nothing to suggest another person had been there. It was almost as if the stranger never existed. And soon, police began to suspect the unthinkable. Maybe he didn't. But who was Diane Downs? And what could possibly drive a mother to turn a gun on her own children? Diane was born in 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona. From a young age, people described her as rebellious and difficult. She often clashed with her parents, and by high school, she was restless, craving freedom and attention. She married her high school sweetheart, Steve Downs. But the marriage quickly turned sour. They argued constantly about money, about Diane's behavior, about the children. Friends said Diane never seemed satisfied. She wanted more excitement, more freedom, more men. By the time she was in her late 20s, Diane was a single mother of 3. To outsiders, she played the role of a struggling, hardworking mom. But those who knew her closer saw something darker. They saw a woman who craved the spotlight, who loved being the center of attention, who could be manipulative when things didn't go her way. And in 1983, Diane had become obsessed with a man named Robert Nick Knickerbocker. Nick was already married, and while he enjoyed Diane's company, he had made one thing clear. He did not want children in his life. For Diane, this was a problem, a big problem. She told friends that her kids were becoming a burden, something weighing her down, keeping her from the life she thought she deserved. It was a thought so dark, so unnatural, that most mothers could never imagine it. But to Diane, it became an idea she could not let go of. As investigators dug deeper, they began to suspect that Diane Downs had staged the entire shooting, that she had pulled over on that lonely road, taken out a .22 caliber pistol, and one by one shot her own children, then shot herself lightly in the arm to make it look like she had been attacked. But suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof, and that proof would come from the only surviving witnesses who truly knew what had happened that night: the children themselves. The hospital hallways in Springfield were heavy with silence in the days after the shooting. Doctors worked around the clock to save Christy and Danny. Machines beeped, tubes and wires surrounded their tiny bodies, and nurses whispered prayers under their breath. Cheryl was gone, and nothing could bring her back. Danny would never walk again. Christy's survival was uncertain. And yet, Diane Downs walked through those halls almost untouched. Just a small bandage on her arm. The medical staff noticed something strange. While most parents in her situation would be sobbing at their children's bedsides, Diane laughed, smiled, and even flirted with the doctors. Some said she seemed more worried about the stain of blood on her clothes than the fact her daughter had died. One nurse recalled, "She asked me if I thought her hair still looked okay. Couldn't believe it. Her kids were fighting for their lives, and that's what she cared about." To the investigators, these red flags were impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, detectives were piecing together Diane's life. They interviewed friends, family, and co-workers. What emerged was a disturbing portrait of a woman who wanted to be free from responsibilities, free from her children, free to chase the man she was obsessed with, Robert Nick Knickerbocker. Nick was terrified of children. He had told Diane more than once, "I'll never be with a woman who comes with kids. That's not the life I want." For Diane, those words weren't a deal-breaker. They were a challenge. And soon, it seemed, she had come up with a twisted solution. If the children were no longer there, Nick would finally be hers. But how do you prove a mother shot her own children? Investigators had the suspicion, but they needed evidence. First, they looked at the gun. Ballistic tests confirmed that the bullets found in the children's bodies matched a .22 caliber pistol that Diane had once owned. She denied it. She claimed she no longer had the gun, that it was gone. But evidence began to stack up against her. Second, they checked her story about rushing to the hospital. Witnesses along the road described seeing her car moving slowly, not racing. Some even said it looked like she was taking her time. Third, they studied her behavior. In interviews with police, Diane described the shooting without shedding a single tear. She laughed, she made jokes, and then came the strangest moment of all. While on camera, Diane reenacted the night of the shooting for investigators. She showed them how she supposedly struggled with the stranger, how she claimed he shot her kids. But while acting it out, she smiled. She even giggled. To detectives, it was chilling. To the public, once the footage aired, it was unforgettable. And then came the most powerful evidence of all, the words of her own daughter. It took weeks before Christy was strong enough to speak. Her body had been torn apart by bullets, and doctors weren't sure she would ever recover. But when she finally opened her mouth to tell the truth, every person in the room felt a chill. Christy whispered that it wasn't a stranger who shot them. It wasn't a man on the road. It was their mother. The child's words were heartbreaking but clear. She remembered watching Diane pull out the gun. She remembered her siblings screaming. She remembered the gunshots. And she remembered Diane turning the weapon on her next. Christy's testimony would become the cornerstone of the case. In 1984, Diane Downs was arrested and charged with murder, attempted murder, and assault. Her trial would become one of the most shocking in American history. When she entered the courtroom, people expected to see a broken woman, devastated by the loss of one child and the suffering of the others. Instead, they saw a woman who smiled at the cameras, waved to reporters, and acted as if she were a celebrity. During the trial, prosecutors painted a disturbing picture. Diane Downs had shot her children in cold blood because they were obstacles in her way. She wanted to be free for Nick, free to live without the burden of 3 young kids. The defense tried to argue she was a victim, that a mysterious stranger had really done it. But there was no evidence, no stranger, no footprints, no signs of anyone else. And then Christy, now just 9 years old, took the stand. The courtroom held its breath as the little girl, her voice trembling, pointed directly at her mother and told the jury the truth. "My mom did it." It was the most heartbreaking moment of the trial. The betrayal was clear. The jury didn't need much more. On June 17, 1984, Diane Downs was found guilty of all charges. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. The judge made sure she would never have the chance to hurt her children again. But Diane's story didn't end there, because even behind bars, she refused to admit guilt. She gave interviews, smiling at reporters, insisting she had been framed, insisting the real killer was still out there. In one chilling moment during an interview, she even said, "If I had shot my kids, would I not have done a good job?" The words sent a shiver through anyone who heard them. Meanwhile, Christy and Danny, the 2 surviving children, faced a future full of pain but also a chance for healing. They were adopted by the prosecutor who had put Diane behind bars, a man named Fred Hughey. He and his wife gave the children a safe, loving home, something Diane had failed to provide. Diane Downs has been denied parole multiple times. Each time she appears before the board, she gives the same story, that she is innocent, that someone else was responsible. But each time, the board sees through her lies. To this day, she remains in prison, and her story remains one of the darkest examples of maternal betrayal in true crime history. The case forces us to ask difficult questions. How could a mother, the one person children should trust above all others, turn a gun on her own flesh and blood? How could love become so twisted by selfishness and obsession? For Diane Downs, the answer was chillingly simple. In her mind, nothing mattered more than herself, not even her children. When the verdict came down in 1984, the courtroom was silent for a moment. Diane Downs stood tall, staring ahead as if nothing had happened. No tears, no visible regret. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. For most people, that would have been the end of the story. But Diane wasn't like most people. Even in prison, she found ways to keep the spotlight on herself. She gave interviews to newspapers and TV shows, insisting she was innocent. She spoke with a calm, almost cheerful tone, as though she was talking about someone else's crime, not her own. In one interview, she said, "Everybody says you have to feel remorse for what you've done. I don't feel remorse for things I didn't do." Then she smiled. To many watching at home, it was chilling. But life in prison didn't stop Diane from trying to manipulate her way out. In 1987, just 3 years after her conviction, she managed to escape from prison. She scaled a fence and disappeared into the night. For 10 days, the state of Oregon was on edge. Police searched everywhere. Parents locked their doors. People were terrified that the woman who had killed her daughter and tried to kill her other children was free again. Where was she hiding? It turned out, Diane had escaped to see a man she had become infatuated with through letters. But she was caught and sent back to prison. This time, the punishment was even harsher. Extra years added to her sentence and tighter security. Still, she never admitted guilt. Her surviving children, Christy and Danny, were adopted by prosecutor Fred Hughey and his wife. They grew up far away from Diane, finally in a safe home filled with love. But the scars never left. Danny remained paralyzed, confined to a wheelchair. Christy, though she survived, carried trauma from that night that would last a lifetime. Imagine being 9 years old and pointing to your own mother in court, saying, "She did it." That memory doesn't just fade. And yet, with time, both children found strength. They learned to move forward. They built lives outside of the shadow of Diane Downs. Diane, on the other hand, has faced the parole board several times, in 2008, 2010, and 2020. Each time, she stood before them claiming innocence. Each time, the board looked at her lack of remorse and her inability to take responsibility. And each time, they denied her freedom. When asked in one hearing about her children, she deflected. She spoke about herself, about how unfairly she had been treated. Never once did she show genuine concern for the lives she destroyed. It became clear that prison walls couldn't contain her narcissism. So here we are, decades later, and the story of Diane Downs still lingers in true crime history. A mother who should have been a protector became the ultimate betrayer. It leaves us with haunting questions. How could a mother place her own desires above the lives of her children? Was Diane's obsession with love and attention so powerful that it erased her natural instincts as a parent? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, if Christy had not survived to testify, would Diane have walked free? The case of Diane Downs is a reminder that evil doesn't always come in the form of a masked stranger. Sometimes it comes from the very person you trust the most. And that's what makes the story so unforgettable and so terrifying.